Thank you for the introduction there, Amra. I'm really happy to be here today and be talking with you all about really what's changing in the landscape of software delivery as we start to think about the impacts AI is having on not just what we build, but how we build it. Today we're going to be talking more specifically about this concept of manage the work, not the people. If you've ever done any reading on Kanban or anything around flow practices, this is probably something you've heard before, manage the work, not the people. We're going to talk about what this means and why it matters so much now when we start to think about AI being a really pivotal part of our software development lifecycle. We're going to take the perspective here of thinking about this in terms of flow management and why it matters in thinking about how do we streamline the flow of value to our customers. But I want to keep coming back to this principle that in order to manage flow, we really have to think about work and not who's doing the work or maybe what agent is building that work. So let's dig into this. As we start to think about how AI is amplifying what we do every year, there's a lot that can go right and a lot that can go wrong. If you think about the speed and the volume with which we can now introduce code changes into our production environments, there's also a very high potential cost of building the wrong thing. We can build things quickly. We can introduce change very quickly. But as the scale of all of this and the volume of all of this change gets amplified, there's really a very high chance that we're shipping the wrong things or that we're starting more work than we can finish, which if you've ever heard me talk at all from a product perspective, when we think about the volume of change or the volume of work that we can start, but maybe gets stuck somewhere in the system or cannot be shipped, that's all really an investment that we've made without a return on that investment, right? That's a sunk cost that has not returned any value yet. So all of this starts to compound when we think about how easy it is to make changes with AI. So when we think about this, we want to think about a few core concepts here. As AI can start to accelerate everything we do, being able to see the work is going to be critical. We're going to talk today about visibility, alignment, and focus, and specifically how these things really become important in helping us manage the work and manage the flow of work. When we think about visibility, I know this always seems like such an obvious thing from an agile perspective. Regardless of what practices you're using, we always talk about visibility of the work. But I think everybody can probably relate to being in environments where you may have a great board set up where you can see all of the priorities or all of the work that you've pulled in for a sprint, but then all this other work is also happening on the side, right? The shoulder taps, the one-off 5-minute requests that turn into a few days of troubleshooting. So when we start to talk about managing the work, visibility becomes a critical piece of that. We need to be able to see all of the work in one place from start to finish so that we can really identify if work is stuck. That's the goal there. Once we can see where those bottlenecks are maybe popping up in our system, it's going to help us figure out how to go take the appropriate steps to get that work moving forward. When we talk about alignment here, we're going to be talking about alignment to strategy. And I think alignment to strategy has always been really core to what we're trying to achieve with agile practices. But when you think about how easy it is to introduce change in an environment where you're leveraging AI tools for coding, it's very easy to start to maybe deviate from what you had intended or what you wanted your organization to be focused on. And this is really bidirectional alignment. So we may say that there's these 5 things that are our top strategic outcomes for the year, and all of our work and all of our features should align to those outcomes. But we all know that once we start working and we start getting kind of caught up in the day-to-day of what we're building, we can start to veer from that strategy. And that's common, and it's not always bad, but how do we see it? How do we catch it before we get to the end of the year and go, we didn't hit any of these 5 objectives, what were we working on instead? We want to create a system that's going to make it really easy for us to spot that in real time, and we'll come back to that here in a moment. And the last thing here is focus. So it's probably no surprise, but when we start to think about focus and alignment to strategy and the flow of work, It's super easy to keep pulling new work in and keep starting new work, but how do we try to cut out a lot of the distractions so that we're really just focusing on the things that are top priority to our customers and to our business? So let's talk about what this looks like. I'm going to share some maybe outsides of software delivery examples for you here. I always love to try to pull metaphors from other parts of life, or examples from other parts of life. So let's talk about this. I want to start first with bottlenecks. And I think when we think about AI and bottlenecks, one of the things that's really important to acknowledge is that these bottlenecks are always going to be moving. I'll share some examples here of what I'm already seeing with organizations where bottlenecks may have been kind of pushed downstream or now are moving upstream in the process. But the point there is that they're always moving, right? So we need to have a system where we can see them so we can address them quickly. I am located in Denver, Colorado, in the middle of the US, roughly. And if anyone has ever flown through Denver, maybe you were here for the Agile conference last year, you probably had the extreme pleasure of flying through Denver International Airport. Now, there's a few things that are important to know about Denver International Airport. There are a bunch of weird, conspiracy theories, weird folklore that surrounds the airport and some of the art and some of the, imagery, I would say, that's at the airport. There's this very creepy horse that greets you on your way in and out of the airport. His eyes glow red for some odd reason, and my kids are terrified of him. I think his official name is Blucifer. And he actually fell on the sculptor who created him and killed him. So just to add to the DIA folklore for you. Okay, where am I going with this? Let's talk about a few things here. So this is a map that you see of Denver International Airport, right? Down at the bottom. So we're going to go from the bottom of that image up. That's the main terminal. There's an east side, a west side. Security is there. You see the stars for security. They're actually working right now on expanding some of that security into other parts of that main terminal, but everybody comes into that main terminal. Then you'll see the concourses, right? We have concourse A, concourse B, concourse C, depending on where you're flying out of. Cool story. There is one train that takes you to all of those concourses. So from the terminal, you go down, you hop on the train, and you can take it to B or C. There is a walkway to A, but not to B or C. So you have to take the train. So this is actually a picture of the security lines on the left here, right around the holidays. And DIA was kind of notorious for having just horrendous security lines at peak travel season. And you could see this definitely during COVID, it looks like here with all the masks that everybody's wearing. And so as they've tried to expand security, they put new security spots in kind of where you see all those 600 numbers on the right and left in blue and green. So new security has been added. Security has gotten so much faster. What do you think happened after they made security faster? No wait times. This is a view of the trains, right? So I think in this particular case, one of the trains even went down. So they were down to one line, but peak travel season. So this just pushed all the waiting that was taking place at security down into the trains. And so one of the things that I think this is a lot like what we're seeing in AI software development right now, right? The bottleneck is moving. We may have made development faster, but we probably pushed some of the delays into other parts of our system. When I think about that from a development perspective, even in the last couple months, I'm hearing that this is shifting. So when you think about, making development faster, there are many teams that are using things like Claude to create the first pull request, make the first pass of changes based on whatever requirements are in that ticket, and then it goes into a code review state. Well, picture this beautiful lineup here of people waiting for the train as now we need a human to do the code review. If we don't have enough capacity to handle that work's going to get stuck. And so even though we can speed up development, if we don't have enough capacity downstream to be able to do those code reviews, or do that testing, we've just created weight in a different part of our workflow. I think this is really interesting. I was just having this conversation earlier in the month with a CTO who was saying they have actually shifted all of their human review process to be further upstream, further to the left of when the development starts or when that first pull request is created, so that they're investing more heavily in having developers review the PRD that's going into the ticket that Claude is then pulling that first pull request to create. So that hopefully that's starting to create more flow downstream and the need for fewer reviews after the code is created. Again, what we just said, this bottleneck is going to continue to shift. And I don't think it's ever going to be something where we can point and say, now it's always here, now it's always in testing. It's going to move around. And so one of the things we want to think about is how do we create a workflow and a system that's going to make it easy to see where this bottleneck is at any given point in time. Maybe it's testing, right? Maybe now we've overloaded testing. Maybe it's in deployment, right? Maybe we've made so many changes we can't get them into production fast enough. Maybe it's that we can't get enough feedback, right? If we've created a system where we can introduce change really quickly, it might be that we're not able to get customer feedback or customer validation of the changes that we're introducing quickly enough. So all of this to say it is critical in AI that we make our workflow visible. And that means that we need two really important things. Once we know what our workflow looks like from start to finish, work comes in, where does work start, and how do we know that something is done? How do we make that workflow completely visible from start to finish? And the second, how do we track the age of work that's in that system? Again, I think this seems really obvious when we say it to track work item age, but most tools don't handle this super well. There are, if anybody's interested in and is already using Jira, we do have a great blog post on the ProKanban website that will walk you through how to get total work item age visible on your tickets. I think Azure DevOps does a slightly better job with this out of the box. But our goal here is that regardless of the level of work, this could be features, this could be epics, this could be stories or tasks. How long has this work been in our system? And if it's aged past an acceptable amount of time, what are we going to do about it, right? Just think of it as like a siren or a fire alarm. We want to have a clear signal that that bottleneck has moved somewhere else in our workflow so that we can go address it quickly. So like we said, this might look something like this for your team. You may be able to pull a bunch of tickets into development really quickly, but now they're all piling up in the test column. I want to be able to look at all of these tickets that are in that test column and see how many days they've been in the system from start to today. So not just the time that they've been in the test column, it's total elapsed time from when that ticket started. So that I can see if this is where work is starting to age unnecessarily. I can't do that if I can't see it. So visibility is our first objective here in making sure that we can see our workflow, all of the work that's in that system, and how old each work item is. Okay, next, let's talk about priorities. So AI might not be shifting our priorities, but I do think it's making it potentially harder to track that alignment or to make sure that we're still aligned to the work. Again, I was just talking with a colleague recently who was saying that they were really struggling because they had so many they have a small team of developers, but every developer was kind of going in a different direction and doing work separately, which AI makes that a lot easier, right? For them all to have separate threads that they're working on. But now there were so many parallel streams of work that none of them were really aligned with what the organization had identified as their top priorities. So I want to give you a different example here. Does anybody use this to try to track how many steps they're doing every day, or some version of a tracker? I know it's a great way to track how many steps you've done, maybe decide if you need to take an additional walk. I really think this is a great, if your goal is walking, this is a great way to make sure you get all your steps in. It's constant feedback of how you're tracking throughout the day so that you can make decisions based on whether or not you need to get more steps in or not. But if you do have an Apple Watch, there's probably a different feature that you're probably familiar with. This one. Time to stand up and move a little for 1 minute. So if you do have an Apple Watch, you probably also know this is one of the most searched for help articles about the Apple Watch. How do I stop time to stand reminders? I think by default they go off every hour. I don't know. They're very annoying. And something that I never asked for. I didn't have a stand goal necessarily that I was trying to hit. And so this is one of the ways where you can start to think about, does the work that we're doing align to the things that are the most important for us as a business? If standing was my goal and making sure I was standing every hour, I would love to turn this on. Unfortunately, I was focused on steps. I would rather get reminders throughout the day that said, hey, you have 2,000 steps to hit your goal. Get outside and go for a walk. Maybe instead of it constantly telling me to stand up. So how do we make sure that we're really amplifying the most important work and that we're constantly checking in on that? So we already know we talked about visibility, and that's going to be really the foundation for measuring and tracking all of the work that we're working on. But the next thing is really strategic alignment. Do we know what our objectives are as a business? And not just from a customer perspective, but for the things we're trying to scale with AI. I think what we're seeing too for a lot of organizations is those things are starting to conflict. So they may have OKRs or strategic objectives that are customer facing, but then they also have strategic objectives that are around using AI and introducing AI into their software delivery practices. What's going to be higher priority? I don't know the answer for your business, but it's definitely something to consider. And do those contradict each other in any way? But our goal here is to say, for all of our day-to-day work, can we see how that maps to strategy? I think this is actually very simple to do. You can do it through, if you're using epics, and that's your highest level here of your projects or your initiatives. You could do it with initiatives too. Can you visualize each work item and how it tracks up to those initiatives or strategic outcomes? At a glance, I want to be able to look at my board and say, hey, this team's got 30 pull requests in progress right now, and only 2 of the 30 look like they actually track back up to any kind of strategic objectives. It's not to say that work isn't valuable, but we want to catch this as soon as possible. Back to our fire alarm. I want to be able to go to the team and say, oh, it doesn't look like any of this work is aligned to our strategic priorities or strategic outcomes. Is this still the right work? Or the inverse can be true. Maybe we need to have a conversation about our strategic outcomes. If all the day-to-day work is getting prioritized above those things or above work that helps move the needle on those things, it may be that we need to have a conversation about those strategic outcomes and see if they're the right things. So 2 things to get started with this. First, I know you're going to see visibility everywhere here. It's becoming more and more important, right? Once we have a visible workflow, we need to make strategy visible. So we need to make it very easy to see what work is connected to the highest level of our strategy so that it's really easy to ask questions about where we're spending our time and money. When you think about this, I think one of the most interesting places this conversation starts to come up is before the work starts. And so when we think about having something like a next to pull or a next on deck type of column in between your backlog, and when work starts, if we said we wanted, I don't know, let's say 75% of our work to be going to strategic outcomes, I can use that to say it looks like we have a max of 4 items in that to-do column, and none of those look like they're aligned to any strategic outcomes. So the next one I pull in when there's space available should be something that links back up to a strategic outcome. So that can really help you with prioritization. It can also just help you ask the right questions earlier about where you're spending your team's energy. And then the next piece here is tracking alignment. So we want to know on a regular basis, or I would even say real time if possible, if you have the tools for that. We want to be able to look at the ratio of work that aligns to our strategy as well as what doesn't, so that we can constantly be checking in against those goals. So I do see a lot of organizations set targets for this. Most of the time the targets are kind of pulled out of thin air. That's okay. We got to start somewhere. But if we were to say we want 30% of our work to be innovation, 30% of our work to be strategic, and 30% of our work to be, or 40% of our work to be keep the lights on. Now we've set a target here that we should be able to look and measure at any point in our system. Does the work track back to those target percentages of where we're spending our time? This can look something like this. So let's say we're going to go back to that same board. You can see here across the bottom, we've got color-coded epics, if that's our strategic outcomes, and targets here for how much time we want to be spending, or how much money, we could even say, we want to be spending on each of those different initiatives or epics. So if we say 40, 30, 30, like we did in our first example, well, what are we actually doing? Well, it looks like Epic 1, even though we said we wanted to spend 40% of our effort there, is only 14% of the current work in progress. Epic 2 is a little closer, and Epic 3 is a little closer, both at 21%, and those were targeted at 30. And then we can see the remainder of the work here is all work that doesn't tie back up to an epic. And so this becomes a really important conversation driver, especially if we're missing delivery on the things that we said were the most important. So if I were working with this team, I would probably say, it looks like maybe the next thing we need to pull into the to-do column is a yellow ticket for epic number 1. Or maybe we need to discuss if epic 1 has been deprioritized, or we're making a conscious decision to decrease the amount of focus for that particular work item. It's all about information. It's all about getting that in front of you so you can make a good decision as soon as possible or earlier. Okay, next one. So AI shifts our focus, or maybe I should say it just completely robs us of our focus. I want to give you a different example here. So I despite teaching Kanban for years now and working with Kanban teams, I am horrible about starting things and not finishing them. Kind of ironic, or maybe that's what brought me here in the first place, especially with books and crafts. So let's talk about books for a moment. Does anybody use Audible here for books? I love Audible. It's great for in the car, going for walks. I listen to a lot of books. However, it makes them, and I think you get once you subscribe, Amazon has you get a credit every month so that you can keep, starting new books, right? So your queue ends up looking like this. And if you look at these, there's a lot of unfinished books because I can start them really easily and I don't really have much of an incentive to get them over the finish line, especially because I usually get more excited about some other new book that's been recommended to me. And so when you think about this, AI is kind of enabling the same thing for us now. It's making it super, super easy for us to keep pulling new work into the system. This isn't a bad thing necessarily. We want to come back to, is it the right work that we're starting? Does it map back to that strategic alignment? But how much work is too much work in the system? And one of the things I would look at first when asking this question of, are we starting too much work? Is work leaving the system at the same pace it's coming in? From a Kanban perspective or a flow perspective, we usually talk about this in terms of arrivals and departures. We can go back to the airport example here and say, if there's more planes arriving than are leaving, you're going to get stuck on the tarmac, right? And you have to sit there on the plane and wait until a gate opens up. And you're probably pretty unhappy about that as a customer. So when we think about starting new work, we want to say, does the amount of work we're starting match the amount of work that's leaving? So things aren't aging unnecessarily in our system. And this is true with AI, maybe more than ever, right? So how do we start to control some of the chaos here? What we really want to do is start to say, based on strategic alignment, based on work item age, based on the priorities we have as a business, are we starting work at the right pace so that things are leaving the system at the right pace too? If both of those are going up, then great. You probably have a pretty stable system. But the first thing we need to do is start to look at our system again and say, how do we make sure the amount of change that's coming into our system matches up with the capacity we have to do that work? And so we have to take into consideration things like, where are there human interactions in the system? Back to our first example, where we may need to consider How much capacity do we have to review work? How much capacity do we have to review requirements? Or how much capacity do we have for manual testing before deployment? Wherever we have a human need in our workflow, we're going to need to have this conversation. And the first thing we're going to need to do to manage that is limiting the work in progress. So you may see that in a system or in a workflow where you're leveraging AI for software development, that you might be able to increase your total WIP. But the first thing we need to be able to do is understand how much work is in our system and how much capacity does this team or does this system have, so that the work is constantly moving. And that the first one we talked about with work item age will really help you see where work is not moving. So those go hand in hand. The second part here for minimizing the amount of changes we have or the amount of work started and not finished is making our policies clear. I think when we think about Kanban and flow, everybody tends to think about WIP limits. Work item age is definitely becoming more popular for organizations. Workflow policies feel like the thing that maybe we like to ignore the most, or the easiest, I should say, to ignore when we think about building out a Kanban system. But when we talk about policies, we really want to think about how are we deciding what to work on, and how does work move from one stage of the workflow to the next stage of the workflow. This becomes really important when we're thinking about things like governance, when we're thinking about things like how do we determine if we should be starting new work, right? Do we need budget approval? Do we need product approval? Do we need customer feedback potentially before we start that new work? And are those policies really clear to everyone involved? Again, I guess I'm just bashing Jira all day, but Jira doesn't handle workflow policies super well. Azure DevOps, I think, is a little better, and there's some other tools out there that are really built for this. But when we talk about workflow policies, it's really just something you would want to see on your board so that you can say, is this work ready to move to the next phase of this workflow? So you can see here at the top of each column, it's just telling us what has to be true before work moves from one stage to the next. And if I'm considering something done in the develop column, that means that it's already been peer reviewed, right? You can see here in the test column, if something's done in test, that means automation and UAT are complete. If something is done in the deployment column, that means it's already in production. Not to say that these are the right, I'll put in air quotes here, the right workflow policies, but you need to have a conversation about what these are, especially with AI, because I think there can be a lot of assumptions about where different things are happening in the workflow, and we just want to make it really clear what has to be true before work moves to the next stage of your process. All of this is to help you bring focus, right? So we have WIP limits here. You can see on the board, we're saying how much work can be in each stage of this workflow. Those are the numbers you see across the top there. That's helping us narrow the focus to the highest priority items. And then those workflow policies are really making sure that we are super clear about what it means for work to move forward through this workflow. All of this to say, I think that when we think about the impact that AI is going to have on software development, it's going to be super important that we can see, manage, and measure the flow of work through our system. One of the things maybe the most excited about is already working with organizations where they are using AI tools, for the development process, but it's also migrating the tickets automatically through their workflow. So your board, your Kanban board or your Kanban system is really showing you where the code is rather than showing you what work you should be doing on, right, or working on next. And that, I think, is pretty exciting. We've always struggled in this space, I think, to get the human part of it to reflect what's actually happening, right? Because you have to move the tickets for us to have a clear picture of where the work is and what's happening. But now a lot of that can be automated in your development structure. So let's come back just real quick and recap the things we talked about today. We said the 3 things that were the most important for organizations adopting AI in their software development workflow are visibility, alignment, and focus. For visibility, the most important things are defining and visualizing your workflow and then tracking the age of work in your work. age of active work in your workflow. The second, for alignment, make your strategy visible. Do we know what our most important things are as an organization and as a business? And can I tell by looking at the board how much of our effort is going towards those strategic outcomes or objectives or not, right? So that we can have that conversation sooner. And then focus. We have to limit the amount of changes in our system. Just because it's easy to make them doesn't mean we should. So we want to make sure that we have a really clear picture of how much work we should have in progress at any given time based on the capacity we have to get that work across the finish line. And we want to have clear policies about how work moves from one state to the next, potentially even automating those things where possible so that when we look at this board, we know it's a true picture of where the work is and how close it is to finishing. So let's come back to what we said here at the beginning. Our goal here is managing the work and not the people. When we think about all of these elements and really where we're going from an automation perspective and an AI perspective, we want to make sure that we're managing the work and not so focused on individual roles or individual skill sets even inside of our team. It's really about making the work visible from end to end so that we can make sure that that work is moving through the system at a reasonable rate, that bottlenecks as they move or as work gets stuck can be hopefully addressed quickly. They'll move somewhere else, I promise, but if we can see them at least early in the system, hopefully we can address them quickly. And lastly, just so that we're focusing our work on the highest priority items and getting those things done quickly. I want to thank everybody for joining today, but before we close the session out, I want to come back to the airport because if you haven't been in Denver, this really is pretty crazy. So you'll see some links on here. Everybody, I hope now is officially Googling Denver airport conspiracy theories. There's so many different ones. There's this one here with the hard hat about the Illuminatis. There's one about lizard people, a lizard people lair underneath the airport. I think there's something about the gargoyles. Anyway, Denver International Airport has just completely embraced all this crazy, and these were all signs from inside the airport about some of the crazy theories that are out there about what's actually taking place. Should definitely check it out. And last but not least, would love to see you join the Pro Kanban community. If any of these topics are interesting to you or you'd like to keep this conversation going, you can scan this QR code and join our Slack community. It is open to the public. And lots of great resources on the prokanban.org website where you can find blogs and tips for how to implement a lot of the things that we talked about here today. So thanks everyone. Thanks for coming.